Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining the Family Matters interview series. We are so happy to have you here with us tonight. Just a few reminders for today's webinar. Everybody will be in listen-only mode. So if you have any questions during the webinar, you can enter them into the chat box, and someone from the BCAT team will respond to you in the next 2 to 3 business days. We are pleased to have Dr. William Mansbach joining us tonight from Counterpoint Health Services and the BCAT Research Center. He's going to be talking to us tonight about the impact of social isolation on people with dementia. Joining Dr. Mansbach is Erin Kneffel, the VP of Strategic Integration for Mansbach Health Tools. So Erin and Dr. Mansbach, I will turn it over to you.
Everyone, welcome to today's session of the Family Matters series. We created this series to help families cope and to learn how to meaningfully engage with their loved ones who have dementia and other cognitive symptoms. I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. William Mansbach, our subject matter expert. Dr. Mansbach is the founder and CEO of Mansbach Health Tools, which supports the BCAT Research Center. He's also the CEO and president of Counterpoint Health Services, a multidisciplinary behavioral health company specializing in geriatrics and dementia care. For many years, he was the chief operating officer for the largest geriatric behavioral health care company in the U.S. Dr. Mansbach has an international reputation as a researcher, clinician, and consultant in the aging field. He was a pioneer in the development of memory clinics and is the creator of the BCAT and Enrich systems, which integrate cognitive tests, interventions, and dementia prevention programs. He's the co-author of the award-winning book, Brain Health as You Age, A Practical Guide to Maintenance and Prevention. Welcome to the session, Dr. Mansbach.
Well, Erin, it's good to be with you again.
Can you tell the audience about the work that you're currently doing?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, on the research end, we're still trying to unpack COVID-19, what we think of as the psychological burden associated with this novel pandemic. There's a lot of work in all that. So we've been developing tools that people can use to kind of take their own stress temperature. We've been developing intervention programs to lower that stress. So we've been doing a lot of work on in COVID-19. On the clinical end, we've been advancing our agenda, which is really how do we take care of people better who have dementia and related cognitive impairment. That involves treating people with all kinds of mood disorders and things like that. We've been reaching out, doing a lot of telehealth, working with a lot of other allied healthcare providers. So we're pretty busy between our research and our clinical work.
Sounds good. Well, today's topic, we're going to talk about social isolation and its impact on people with dementia. I guess we need some background information. So really, how did we get here? And also, how is that social isolation such a problem for older adults now, since we're technically past the critical point of COVID-19?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So let's kind of take them in turn. The first thing we should say is that questions of isolation, the impact of isolation is something that's we've understood for a very long time. You can think about it in this way: isolated older adults, maybe living alone in the community. This has been a problem for a long time. So we know from the research literature that when people are isolated, when they don't have what we call meaningful engagement in an optimal kind of way, bad things tend to happen. Some of those are psychological, right? Anxiety, depression, things like that. But a lot of them are physical. So we could anticipate that when the pandemic arrived, when we already had a lot of social isolation, that it would make that situation much worse. And that's the problem that we have right now. So beginning in April, roughly April of 2020, when the pandemic hit, for those listeners who have loved ones in senior living or in a nursing home, frankly, you weren't able to see them, were you? So not only were you isolated from them, but they were isolated. And in turn, many of them had to spend 18 months in some cases a little bit longer in their rooms. They couldn't do activities. They didn't have the normal contact with their nursing staff and so forth. So we got here in part because we've been living with this for a long time. You know the expression, Aaron, you can't run a marathon at sprint speed. You can't hold your breath to get through this. So that's a problem. So that's how we really got here. And I would be remiss to not say that for all of us, an older adult who may have dementia, middle-aged adult who could be the child of this person or such a person, stress can be devastating. And it's devastating psychologically because of what happens in the body. You know, there's this whole sort of stress neurophysiological response. You've heard of things like cortisol, stress hormones, things like that. You know, they're great in the short term, but in the long term, they do destructive things to the body. So this is what we're dealing with right now.
Okay. So what types of symptoms do we generally see in older adults who have been socially isolated from family and friends, but to your point, also people in the community, let's say in the residential community, that they're used to seeing, let's say every week for bingo or, you know, every meal, you know, having a meal with somebody. Now they haven't had that. So what kind of symptoms should we expect when we now are able to visit our loved ones?
3 buckets. So you have symptoms that are characterized by problems of mood, so depressed mood, anxiety, it's sort of the mood twins, you know, if you will. But to understand a little bit better, particularly on the depression end, you may not see, for example, that mom may not say I am depressed, and she may see that, and she may say that, but you know, the anhedonia, the idea that people are less interested in doing things that used to really fire them up and get them going, you're going to see that. So you're going to see worry, anxiety that's more accelerated than what it was before. So one bucket is really around mood. Another one is in cognition, and probably our audience will recognize that most by problems of mood or problems of memory. You know, where a person was able to remember things, and now they seem more forgetful in some ways. And the third bucket are really symptoms that are somatic or physical. So if a person has a chronic illness, maybe diabetes or heart disease or COPD or something of that sort, you're likely to see exacerbations or more frequent and more severe episodes. So mood, cognition, and somatic health issues.
Okay. And is there a difference in the symptoms of individuals with dementia versus individuals who are aging in place in senior living without the diagnosis of dementia?
Yeah, so one of the things that we recognize for people who have dementia, not only are there issues of memory, but there are issues of what we refer to as executive function. And those are all the tools or skills a person has to kind of manage their life in some way. So for a listener who may be feeling anxious or maybe feeling cut off from other people, you know, you would have the ability to say, well, wait, I can solve this problem. I can pick up the phone, I can Skype, I can maybe now I can drive somewhere and so forth. But for a person who has dementia, you don't have that executive skill anymore. So you're more vulnerable. You're more likely to kind of be stuck in those 3 buckets that I talked about without the ability really to get out of it. So older adults with dementia in particular are more vulnerable in a lot of ways, but in a pandemic or in a situation of social isolation, they're actually going to be impacted worse in many cases than other people who have more cognitive abilities to cope with.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for families who live far away from their loved ones, is there a way for them to still be able to meaningfully connect with their loved ones in a different platform, you know, over the phone, or what should they do when they're communicating with a loved one?
So the first thing I'm going to say is that, you know, Aaron, the most important thing is for family members who are listening to manage your expectations and understand that this is a kind of a trial, you know, and failure attempt sometimes before you get it right. And I'll be really concrete, very practical about that. Phones are great. It's a way of connecting with a loved one. But sometimes you have a loved one who doesn't have the capacity anymore, maybe because of those executive, you know, skills eroded, to be able to use the phone or to initiate a phone call, sometimes even to respond to one. So So phone calling is important. Now that comes to sort of a second level when you think about actually seeing a loved one, let's say through FaceTime or Skype. Anything that involves a device, involves technology, involves the need for executive skills. So if you have a loved one who's living in senior living, it would be important to maybe prearrange to have staff member and aide, somebody who could be facilitative of that. That being said, there are workarounds that a person really can do. So sometimes it's the right kind of phone that isn't very complicated, isn't really hard to do. Maybe it's a landline, something where a person can rely on what we call procedural memory, the kind of memory that's automatic that you don't have to think about in some ways. So one issue is how do you reach mom or dad, and how do they reach you? Other issue is, what do you do once you reach them, once you're able to, make that connection in some ways? Because that becomes really critical in a time where we can't routinely just see people whenever we want to.
Right, and that's a nice segue into my next question, actually. So now that we know that there are potentially psychological symptoms, physiological symptoms, cognitive symptoms because of isolation, what are some strategies that families can use when they're connecting with their loved ones so that it is a meaningful opportunity or engagement?
Let's take a step back and think about meaningful engagement, what it really is. So it's a technical term, but it refers to a normal phenomenon. We feel better as human beings when we have an opportunity to be connected to someone else. We feel a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, particularly in familial situations when you can be with a family member, even more so when you're feeling stressed in some ways. Also, if you think about it, conversations where you're meaningfully engaged can activate old memories, can get your brain working in ways where, if you're isolated, it's kind of frozen, right? It's not really working in the way that it needs to in some ways. I will point out that several years ago, we did a project that was supported by Medicare, by CMS, understanding way before the pandemic that meaningful engagement was really important, and that older adults, particularly those with dementia, can feel isolated in some way. So we developed a program called MEMPICS. I know you're familiar with this program, and probably a lot of our listeners are too. MEMPICS programs are used often in nursing homes and senior living, but perfectly appropriate for family members to use with a loved one with dementia. And so it's a method for engaging. And what's interesting about MEMPICS is that the workaround with MEMPICS is that you create a verbal communication, but you don't start with words, you start with pictures. And that's important because in illnesses like Alzheimer's disease, where the language centers are so vulnerable, the visual centers are not. So they're usually intact for a long time. So, suppose that you want to talk to mom about some old memory. Maybe it's about a pet, a dog, something like that. So, you could say, well, mom, you remember, Roger, our dog, and things that we did with Roger. Well, that's really hard if you have dementia, but you're able to show a picture of a dog first. That connection in the brain takes place, and that allows you then to be able to use conversation words for your loved one to do that. So the MEMPICS program is something that we highly recommend because it's a way of restoring meaningful engagement. It's good anyway, but it's particularly good during these times. And you can do it you can do it virtually, and hopefully for many of our listeners, you're able to actually spend more time, let's say in a building or in an apartment, condo, wherever, with a loved one. And you can take your MEMPICS and you can kind of restore some of what was lost. And that's really important.
Okay, great. What about for individuals that maybe had mild cognitive impairment before COVID happened, and with social isolation, social distancing, have more exacerbated or cognitive decline? I'm sure it's very frustrating or difficult to see your mom or dad like that when you go to visit, but what should you do if, the resident starts talking about things that are not current, or, do you correct them? How do you address that or handle that with a loved one, or what recommendations could you give to our listeners for that?
Right. So there's a general way of thinking about this, and then there's some very specific suggestions or recommendations that I'm happy to give. So going to the general first, Erin, I would say that managing expectations, if you haven't seen or spent a lot of time, let's say with mom or dad, or whoever your family member is with dementia, go in with a real open mind that you're likely to see a more deteriorated condition. If you see them in a senior living community, it's very easy to get angry and blameful toward the community itself. It's just sort of human nature. But before you go down that road, it's normal under these circumstances for a person to have lost, let's say, some of their cognitive skills, being a little bit more depressed or anxious or so forth. So that should sort of guide you a little bit. I would also say that it is possible if you have mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and maybe even mild stage dementia, to get back some of those cognitive skills that you had lost through the social separation, social isolation, or social distancing, I guess is the term we've been using now for a year and a half. But rather than waiting passively for it to come back, I would advocate a very active process. And perhaps the most effective thing that you can do is to give mom or dad an opportunity to do what are called working memory exercises. And the reason why that's important is that in the brain, where we do working memory exercises, the brain recruits many parts of itself, sort of the centers that control memory, that control those executive functions we talked about. But oddly enough, it also supports mood functioning. So literally doing working memory exercises is a way of improving cognition. It's a way of improving mood, a way of improving function, and helping with meaningful engagement. And there are appropriate exercises for people who have mild cognitive impairment. Sometimes it's called MCI, or neurocognitive disorder, mild neurocognitive disorder. So certainly we would recommend those kinds of things. Now, for people who have dementia and who are even worse in some ways, it is important not to just correct mom or dad if they're at a place where they can't really see where the air is. You may want them to see things in a certain way, they may not be able to. So changing the topic, misdirection, redirection, things like that are probably important. But if you can do working memory exercises, certainly I would suggest that you try them.
So I'm going to assume that not all working memory exercises are the same. So, I know, you have the BCAT Research Center, so there's a lot of evidence to support the tools that you've created and you use and your team uses at Counterpoint and BCAT. So can you give the listeners some suggestions of ways to identify those exercises or activities that would be most meaningful to use with their loved one?
Sure. So start with science. The brain training, the brain industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Very few, despite their claims of those products, have good science behind them. We always say at the BCAT, it's not sufficient for things to be based on science. They have to be validated by science. So that already sort of removes 99% of the programs that are out there. And by the way, doing things like crossword puzzles and stuff like that, there's nothing wrong with it, and they're fun, and so go ahead and do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing working memory exercises. Those are very specific. So I think the audience will forgive me if I say we're strong proponents of the BCAT working memory exercise, but because it's gone through very rigorous science. So we can say, well, here's a set of exercises, particularly the home edition. I know a lot of people use that, where these exercises, each and every one of them, have been validated by science, particularly if you have mild cognitive impairment. So we're going to suggest that. And as a guideline, I would say that when you go back into, let's say, mom's apartment, and you haven't been there very much, and you're looking around and you're engaging her and so forth, I think the introduction of stimulation should be gradual and incremental. So don't pick mom up and plan a wonderful, overly stimulating trip. Let's be kind of cautious about this, and use the faucet analogy. So you may know this faucet analogy, which is So let's say you step in the shower, and if it's too cold, what do? You make it warmer. If it's too hot, what do? You make it cooler. So you should, as a family member, you're really observing mom or dad or whomever. And if things are overstimulating, don't do them. So just be don't go on your agenda. Try to do what mom and dad really can do. Move them along incrementally.
So it's really about meeting your loved one where they are, not necessarily where you want them to be.
Right, or where you are sometimes. Yes, yeah. Exactly.
So you talked a lot about the Working Memory Exercise book, which is a great resource. But what about for individuals who are pretty tech savvy? We've got a lot of baby boomers who are living in senior living communities who have access to tablets, phones, who might want to do some other types of exercises. And to your point, it's a huge industry for brain health, and not every exercise is the same. So what should somebody be looking out for from that perspective if they want to go with more computer-based exercises?
Yeah, so I'll talk about it again generally and then make a specific recommendation. So generally, if you want to do exercises that have working memory in them, it's important that they're identified as working memory. And so there are so many things that are out there. They look cool, they're nice images. You can do them from a phone, you can do them from, obviously a computer or any other kind of device, but they really need to be working memory exercises to be effective. And frankly, most people can't tell if it's working memory or not. So if it doesn't say working memory, it's probably not very effective. Also, on a very specific note, I'll say that we several years ago developed a number of what we call brain rehabilitation modules. So we started this research thinking that we would have 9 or 10 of them. And at the end of the day, we had exactly 3. And the reason why we only had 3 is that none of the other ones could work. They looked good. They were a lot of fun to do, but the science was not supportive of them. So if somebody wants to try some very specific ones, either for yourself or for a loved one who has some cognitive ability, you don't have to be cognitively intact completely, but at least have no worse than mild cognitive impairment, I would say. You can go on the BCAT website and you can do these brain rehabilitation modules. There's one in particular that has a lot of science that's used a lot, and it's called Memory Match. It's a lot of fun. It's graduated from really easy to really difficult to do. So that would be one suggestion that people could always do.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. So we've talked a lot about what to expect when you see your loved one for the first time, let's say, or for your initial visits, what you can do from a strategy perspective. But we as family members of older adults have gone through a lot too in that social distancing from our families for the duration of COVID. And unfortunately now it's still happening, right? If there's a positive case in a senior living community, then families have to quarantine from their loved ones again for, 2 weeks or whatever the state mandate is. So what strategies, tools, resources can you recommend that families can use to perhaps reduce their own stress and or their, psychological burden that they're experiencing from this isolation event?
So I'm going to talk about the M5, and I'm going to talk about 15 for me, Erin. So we developed a tool called the M5. It's free. You can access it on the Enrich website, enrichvisits.com. And so this is the first and I think only validated, peer-reviewed, published scale for assessing psychological burden or stress associated with COVID-19, but it's valid for any kind of stress. And so what I would advise for a family member who's feeling stress is that, well, let's just kind of take your stress temperature, if you will. So you can do it online, do it privately, do it from your home, get a little report, kind of tell you a little bit about it if you like more information. But that's a good way to begin, just to get a sense as sort of a baseline. You can take it as often as you want. we did this for families. We did 3 different types of studies starting in April of 2020. We completed them in February of 2021. We looked at professional caregivers. We looked at older adults themselves. These were national samples. We looked at families, and what we found was that in April, family members had very high M5 scores. The higher your M5 score is, the more stressed you are. In October of 2020, they were no better, actually just a little bit higher, but statistically about the same. And in the winter of 2021, they were still really very high. And I bet if we did that study again, I think we're going to do it again in September, but if we did it today, we would find that families are still really stressed out. So the M5 is a free tool. Anyone can use it. Please go ahead and access it. I think you'll find it useful. But taking the temperature is a good idea, but it's necessary but not sufficient. And what about a program? What about something that people can do? So we spent a lot of time working on something called 15 for Me, the idea being that if a person can give themselves the gift of 15 minutes a day, there's some very specific things that one can do to lower stress, and we know the science is very supportive of this. This program, 15 for Me, I think people will begin to hear about it, although it really is not going to go live until toward the end of July, which is actually pretty soon, July of 2021. What's exciting about it is that the science supports that you can do these sessions, you can choose them. Some are cardio sessions, some are cognitive sessions. Cognitive sessions use working memory exercises, of course, because those are the best, most efficient. In each type of session, cardio or cognitive, at the end you integrate centered breathing to kind of figure out how to get rid of those toxic stress hormones like cortisol and all that sort of thing. It's the type of program that anyone can do. It's very practical. And we're going to suggest that if your M5 scores are high, this is something that you'll be able to do. And you'll get more information if you want it by going back to the Enrich Visits website, because there'll be a whole program that will be described there. If you go there, today, you might not see it, but if you go tomorrow, so to speak, you'll have information. So that would be one way to go.
Okay, great. That's excellent. And so I'm assuming that's part of a full, brain health program, right?
Right. So if our listeners aren't aware, one of the initiatives we've had for a long time at BCAT is how do we create a real, practical, evidence-based or scientifically validated brain health program. This all started when we were working with advocacy groups, large national advocacy groups for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And I've been arguing for a long time because we don't have medications that work really at this point for somehow curing illnesses like Alzheimer's disease. The real energy needs to be put on how do we prevent it or mitigate or delay onset. I would say to anyone, if you can delay onset for Alzheimer's disease for 5 or 10 years, many people aren't going to develop Alzheimer's disease. So it's really important. And it turns out that there are 6 modifiable behaviors that we talk about on Enrich that if people did them, they would lower their risk. I'm not saying that you would prevent Alzheimer's disease, but there's a very good chance that you would lower risk. And Enrich actually is an acronym that stands for those 6 modifiable behaviors. And in fact, anyone can take the Enrich calculator. It's free. It's just a heuristic and find out, well, how are you doing today in terms of those 6 modifiable behaviors? So if you think about it, 15 for Me is consistent with that whole approach. What's practical, what's cost effective, what's something that people will really do that's sustainable, Aaron. You don't have to go and spend money on an expensive gym membership. You don't have to buy a $2,000 bike. You don't have to buy, well, you may want to, expensive workout stuff. There are very practical things that you can do that can really improve your brain health inside a pandemic, but also outside the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And that's for family members, but also their loved ones who are not living in a residential community, because we've got many of those who were also socially distanced from their loved ones, right?
Exactly so. Right.
So as we wind down today, I just want to ask you, I mean, we've talked about so many different things and so many actionable resources for family members to do for themselves and for their loved ones. If there were, the top 2 items that you would strongly recommend, are important to use with their loved ones now, would it be, focusing on brain health? Would it be meaningful engagement? Does it matter where the resident or their loved one is in that progression of cognitive decline, what you're going to do?
Right. So I would say for people who have advanced dementia, what we would say moderate stage or more severe dementia, I would say Mempics because it has good science behind it. And it's really wonderful to get somebody back and somebody perk up in some ways. So, those are all thematic books. So, the books on travel, on cooking, on all kinds of things. So you're really engaging a loved one in an old memory, and it's curative. It doesn't move the clock back for dementia, but it's curative emotionally, often for the family member to really kind of bask in the sort of in the present, in the here and now with a loved one, where mom all of a sudden can remember going to Paris and what that was like and so forth. She may not be able to remember what she had for lunch an hour ago, but this really counts. So I think for people who have dementia, Mempics is really a good idea. For those who are more cognitively intact, working memory exercises are really critical for not just brain health, mitigating risk for the decline, they are, but really for improving mood and kind of recovering a little bit from the pandemic, what we refer to as COVID-19.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Mansbach, for joining me today, and especially all of the tools and resources for our families. And thank everybody today for joining us during our Family Matters series. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Mansbach and Erin. If anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat box now, and someone from the BCAT team will respond to you in the next 2 to 3 business days. We would also like to take a moment to invite you to become a member of the Enrich Brain Health Program by signing up on our Enrich website, which is www.enrichvisits.com. And if you're interested in more information from the BCAT Research Center, you can also follow us on our social media websites on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for joining this episode of Family Matters series, and we hope to see you again for our next episode in August entitled How the 15 for Me program can help reduce stress for families. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.